So let's get started with the last talk of the workshop and of the program and of the year and everything. With who could be a better speaker at the end for the celebration of the workshop. So yeah, with that, I mean, basically, I don't need to introduce Ben. He did a lot of had a lot of important contributions in optimization, learning. So I first learned about his work on matrix completion, using nuclear norm minimization. And then he also was co-author of the Test of Time Award with about random features. He came roughly to Berkeley the same time I was a grad student. And so one of the things I learned from him actually as a role model in basically always following what you think is important, what you're curious about, and not just following what you can solve, like what techniques you know, and just go on like with that. So that's something I've really learned from Ben and many others at Berkeley, but that's something I remember. So now he'll tell us about yet some other, with his broad interest in literally everything, can ask him about everything. He'll had read some interesting book about. So today it's not going to be different. He's going to tell us about the body, the wisdom of the body.
Thank you, Fanny. And I'm glad that my random irreverence was, rubbed off. That was great. So this is the last talk of the program. I just realized that. It's also kind of interesting. It's the first time I've given it. And I probably put more work into it than necessary. That's all right. That's all right. So, well, no, this is one of those tricky points when you over optimize. It doesn't always go where you want it to go. So let's find out. Let's find out. So bear with me on this. It's been something I've been thinking about for a long time now, and trying to figure out a way to. I'm still trying to figure out a way to tell the story. You folks are the first trial audience. This is my public opinion panel. And I guess just because it's the first time I've given it, let me ask that we hold questions to the end. But if I say something that's weird, or if you see a typo, which they're definitely going to be typos, then please feel free to let me know. Okay, good. So the outline today. First, I'm going to talk about homeostasis and perhaps define it. I was asked to define it. And I will then move to mathematical models of homeostasis. And through that, we're going to see a emerging kind of necessity of integral action. I'll tell you what that is, why it's important, and then make a turn of that. What if it's so important, can we actually use that as a means of therapy for whatever it is that we're hoping to treat? So that's where we're hoping to go. And let's just start with this idea of homeostasis. So in 1932, Walter Canon wrote a book called The Wisdom of the Body. And this is the book that coined the term homeostasis. His quest was, you look at the body and it's a system of all of this fragile stuff. If you electrocute it, or you put it in some room with poisonous gas, it immediately dies. But in other situations, it surprisingly lives. So how does a body maintain some kind of notion of constancy despite the world being out to get it? At least that was the way that Canon phrased it. We don't all have to be so paranoid. And Canon wanted to come up with a book that established the general principles that maintain this constancy. I should note that this is a professor of physiology. So what are the physiological principles that we need to maintain such constancy? And in doing so, this is the passage that I think is very important. He made a strong distinction between equilibrium and homeostasis. And this is how he defines homeostasis, as by contrast to equilibrium. So equilibrium, maybe we just read it. The constant conditions which are maintained in the body might be termed equilibria. That word, however, has come to have a fairly exact meaning as applied to relatively simple physico-chemical states in closed systems where known forces are balanced. The coordinated physiological processes which maintain most of the steady states in the organism are so complex and so peculiar to living beings, invoking as they may the brain, the nerves, the heart, the lungs, the kidney, and the spleen, all working cooperatively, that I've suggested a special designation for these states, homeostasis. The word does not imply something set and immobile. It is not a stagnation. It means a condition that can vary, but which is relatively constant. It's very, very interesting. So what is homeostasis? If you look at the word, it's sameness. Roughly what it means. So it's active working to maintain, you're constantly acting to maintain stasis, is maybe the way to think about it. That's how Canon thought about it. And he has so many examples in 1932. And it's kind of hard to appreciate how ahead of his time these examples were. So for example, he talks about blood clotting, which was known at the time, and starts to get at some of the causes behind it. And this would, in a few years, lead to how we treat clotting disorders with blood thinners. In 1932, we had just begun to understand what insulin does and what its role was. And this was now before it was even given to humans to treat diabetes. That would come over the next 20 years. He also has this whole epilogue about how we can think about homeostasis in social systems. And this would give, in about a decade, would give rise to a whole movement in cybernetics that constantly refers back to Canon's word homeostasis. You read anything on cybernetics or even early AI before they branched off away from Norbert Wiener, they were always thinking about this idea of homeostasis as a necessary condition for intelligence. So there's lots of stuff here. We could focus on all sorts of things. I'm going to focus on chapter 9, just to give you a clear example, which is the homeostasis of blood calcium. So what Canon had observed is that calcium seemed to have some, we know that it was, you need it for bones, to grow your bones. It seemed like it had something to do with muscle signaling, and it also played a role in blood coagulation. So a very important mineral. And the calcium concentration in blood, Canon observed, was constant. And we know this. This is one of the most tightly regulated things in our body. We really work very hard to keep our calcium concentration constant. If you have too little calcium, you have all sorts of nervous disorders, muscle twitches, spasms. If you have too much, your blood thickens. So you want to keep it right on this one line. I think it's like 9 milliliters, 9 parts. I can't remember. You'll see the actual number on a couple of slides. I can't remember the exact number. So some things were clear. One, if you took out or injured the parathyroid gland, if you took out or injured the parathyroid gland, the calcium homeostasis would go completely amok. It would be a terrible situation. Canon also observed that calcium was clearly stored in bones in these very particular structures, which are called trabeculae. So you can see at the top here, this is a picture from a photograph taken of a bones of a cat. And which one? Let's see. The top is the high calcium diet, and the bottom is a calcium deprived diet. And you see that there's structures here that are maintaining calcium in the bones themselves. Okay, so the bones are doing something. And he also observed that vitamin D seemed to be essential somehow. Vitamin D, by the way, discovered about 2 years before this book. So vitamin D was essential. The parathyroid gland was essential. And the bones somehow could store or release. They were like a reservoir of calcium. Our modern view, and this is from a paper by Mustafa Kamash, has a beautiful description of this, how this calcium homeostasis works, is that you have our blood, just as this diagram here, and then something that causes the calcium to go up or down. This is our disturbance V. One common place where calcium disturbance is really bad is for lactating mothers, because they have a lot of calcium in the milk, and so they have to constantly replenish that calcium content that they're losing through lactation. So there it is, 9 milligrams per deciliter is the amount of calcium that we would like our blood to have at all times. That funny picture there is the parathyroid gland. And so when the calcium level goes down, the parathyroid gland tries to increase, releases parathyroid hormone. Okay, so what we try to have here is that the amount of parathyroid hormone is proportional to the amount of calcium in the bloodstream. And the parathyroid gland regulates that. This parathyroid hormone, P, talks to the bones. And the bones themselves, the amount that they store is also proportional to the amount of parathyroid hormone in the bloodstream. There's two things. And then the kidney is where the vitamin D action is happening. The kidney takes parathyroid hormone and it takes inactive vitamin D and turns it into active vitamin D. So any parathyroid hormone it sees, if it has some vitamin D nearby, it activates it. And then the amount of vitamin D that's active in your bloodstream is the amount of calcium that's extracted through your intestine from food. So we put this all together. We have our parathyroid hormone. Did not realize how hard that word is to say. We have vitamin D. We have the set point that we're trying to track. And then Ca is just our calcium concentration. We can write this in equations. So the amount of calcium in a future time step is just whatever in the blood now, minus this disturbance, and then a resupplementation by the bones, proportional to P, and by the kidney, proportional to the amount of vitamin D. The amount of hormone is tracking a set point, and that set point is R0. The amount of vitamin D is the amount of hormone. Every bit of hormone just adds some to the blood, so it has this additive structure. It sort of looks like it's doing gradient descent on the level of parathyroid hormone. And actually, that's kind of what's happening. Let me write that out. So if E here is the thing we're trying to track, we'd like E to be 0. Well, then the amount of hormone is proportional to E. And if you write out this, expand out the equations here, the amount of vitamin D is proportional to the sum of E. And so I could think of this signal as a control signal from the body, which is why I'm using some control letters. I'm calling that U. U is the sum of the amount of hormone and the amount of calcium. And so we could think about what's happening here. We're doing proportional feedback through the bones of the calcium level. And here we're doing integral feedback. We are really, this gradient descent-like thing is integrating the error. So if I put that all together, I get a difference equation for this whole process. The calcium is equal to the body's control signal minus, so the new calcium is the current calcium plus the amount we're resupplementing, which is our control signal, minus the disturbance. And the control signal is an integral of the error plus the error itself. And so I could write this beautiful diagram of the body as this more control theory looking thing, where we have a reference signal that we're trying to track. I don't know, just for my control theorists in the room, there are a couple of you here. We have a disturbance signal that we're trying to track, and we can write out the full control structure here. So it is kind of amazing that what's happening inside your body is this thing that we can identify quite clearly as a proportional integral controller. There are two features here. One, you have one thing. The proportional part is important, and it happens in multiple stages. And then this integral part is because you have to resupply. You're constantly resupplying this vitamin D level, which which gets cleared as you eat food. So that's kind of remarkable. Now, why would that be a good design? Why is proportional integral control a good design? Let me tell you. This is one of these things. I think every machine learning person already knows this, but let me now articulate it for you. Let's just think that we have a proportional integral controller. Okay, and like I said, this integral thing, you can implement this with something that looks like gradient descent. It looks very gradient descent-like. So just assume for a second that all of these signals converge to constants. So the error signal, let's assume that converges to a steady state. The control signal, let's assume it converges to a steady state. And the integral of the control signal, or the sum of the control signal, let's assume it converges to a steady state. If it reaches a steady state, the only one that is possible is when the E is 0. This is just like saying if gradient descent converges, it's going to find something with the gradient equaling 0. Same argument. And you just write it out here. What happens? I could just slightly rewrite the equation to have this sum of the difference from the error steady state. And what happens is you just get a factor of t times something that's constant. The only way that this thing can converge to a constant is if this one term is 0. So that because it's multiplied by t. So that means that E infinity is 0. There's our single proof in the talk today. So a controller with integral action will always yield the correct steady state, provided that a steady state exists. Okay, so that's our mathematical model says if you have an integrator somewhere in your system, then if a steady state exists, the only one you can get is the correct steady state. And we can think of this as being able to adapt to changing and unforeseen disturbances. And here's our bit about generalization. We are building a system that can adapt. So Kamash defines perfect adaptation in his survey paper as a signal, a system regulating some signal to a constant, no matter what the constant disturbance is. We change the environment. We move ourselves from Berkeley to Philadelphia. That's Conrad's example. Our body temperature stays the same, as does our calcium level. We change the environment, and we are able to still exist. And this is what we call perfect adaptation. Now, what does perfect adaptation mean for us? Is that we have this black box body. We have some disturbance that comes in, and we have a regulated signal that we'd like to remain constant. And so in math, we're saying that for any value d for this disturbance, the output value converges to the same r. So we can change the value d, and we get the same r. That's what we mean by perfect, a system that can perfectly adapt. And a theorem, which is I'd be happy to show you over lunch. Let's put it that way. It's like 3 lines of linear algebra, but then we have to talk about state space. But I will show you over lunch if you're interested. For linear systems, an integral control is necessary and sufficient to have perfect adaptation. So you have to somehow, inside that black box, have a hidden integrator. And for nonlinear systems, an internal integrator is sufficient. It might not be necessary. It's necessary necessary locally, but it might not be necessary globally. But it's sufficient. And that kind of points to the second half of the talk that I want to go into, is it points to a way to think about therapies. And indeed, one of the therapies that we know now is how would I treat diabetes? Diabetes is a dysregulation disorder. Right? We know that type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder that prevents your pancreas from producing insulin, but we could treat it by applying some kind of integral control on the insulin signal to make your blood sugar constant. Okay, points to lots of different ideas for therapy. Ooh, sorry, that was an important animation I just deleted. There we go. There's the word. What did I skip? Nothing that important. All right. So 20 years after, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. The integral term, you understand why the other term? Aha. Another thing we should discuss over lunch, why proportional? Proportional gets you robustness. And you could think of it, machine learning friends, proportional is like adding weight decay to gradient descent. I'm serious. So that's what it gets you robustness, whereas the gradient term is getting you the steady state correctness. So usually that's why you always see a proportional term every time you have an integral term. You might also know, I didn't talk about today, but usually people talk about PID controllers. The D would be the derivative of the error. Happy to talk about when you might want to use that over lunch as well. But those are a little bit harder to find, both inside your body and also in practice. So if you go look in engineering practice, D is usually not used. All right, so let me talk about this general adaptation syndrome. This was discovered 20 years after Canon by another physiologist, Hans Selye. And to motivate it, let me stick with math first before we talk about biology. Let us just assume for now, because linear systems are easy, that we have a linear model. Any linear model can be written as a convolution with the system and the disturbance. The output is going to be a convolution of some impulse response with the disturbance. Okay. So if I have a linear system that obeys perfect adaptation, so that in linear systems, the only thing that are possible for your steady states are zero, which is why we look at errors. So if I have a linear system where that output has to converge to zero for every d, that is just for every constant d, that necessarily means that the sum of this impulse response has to equal zero. It's the only thing that's possible there. That's roughly what that equation is already telling us at the top. And so what that means is that if I have a shock and I'm brought out of homeostasis, and my body acts now to move back to that set point, it has to overcorrect. There must be overcompensation because the sum of this thing has to be zero. So if you go negative from some kind of disturbance, there has to be this funny thing of overcorrection. That overcorrection might not be what we want. We're adapting to the environment, and yet we're somehow getting into a weird state of non-constancy. We're overshooting where we'd like to be. It could look non-desirable, but I want to talk about a number of things built on the idea that overcompensation can be useful. In order to do that, I have to zoom out. These simple models of keeping one single signal constant are great. But as we all know, our body is a network of lots of different signals that want to be constant and lots of different actuation means to get that to work. This is an image from a paper by Arthur Guyton, yet another physiologist, who tried to build a differential equation model of the human circulation system. It's from 1972. It's a digital twin. You can download it. So you can go and tell, but I don't know if Bruno is still here, but I feel like this is like the digital twin of the fly brain. That you've actually tried to go and run this model, it's not going to tell us much useful. Because what we only get from when we unisolate the system, we put it all together, we look at a closed loop, we get a bulk system. But what Selye, and where all these parts are interacting, and everything kind of looks like a mess. But what Selye observed is the bulk system has this funny property of overcompensation in all sorts of different scenarios. So this is the plot from Selye's paper of giving the fun part about being biology. The number of the experiments are all horrifying. So in this experiment, I showed you the cat bones. What did they do to those poor cats? Anyway, but this is a rodent experiment, and they gave I think it was mice or rats, they gave them a toxin. What they found is that initially the resistance to the toxin goes down, but it overcompensates. It overcompensates for a while as you keep giving it toxin. And then unfortunately, if you keep going, it gets to somehow whatever the body was trying to do gets exhausted, and this line is death. So this line is death. So you exhaust the system. So there's a pattern, and Selye has lots of different examples in this in his book of a pattern of resistance to shock. How many samples do they collect? He has a lot of different examples, vignettes you might call them, because this. I mean, how many poor mice have died for our knowledge? So the main observations in this, repeated throughout the paper, is that you have this kind of initial thing of being in shock, and then there's this alarm signal that the body then overcompensates. And the transient shock recovers faster than the adaptations decay. And so processes that are working to maintain homeostasis, this whole big bulk processes, have this pattern of overshooting. So the aggregate properties of a homeostatic system, we don't necessarily reject disturbances. I can't prove that because I don't know what signals are constant, But what does seem to carry over from the small to the big is this persistent overshooting, overcorrection. You could think that maybe that's evolutionarily makes sense. Like if you're hurting me, I assume you're going to hurt me more. I don't know. But I'm very bad with evolutionary arguments. Let's just leave it as empirical fact. So Selye's paper would inspire a therapy technique called progressive overload that is both used in physical therapy for treating people who have had injuries or some kind of other debilitating condition to get back to some state where they can act, but it's also used in sports science. The idea is that if I have a system where if I stress it and it adapts, and it is not a perfectly adapting system, that I can take this overcompensation, act again here, add a stress during the overcompensation, and perhaps get that curve that Selye was seeing, moving ourselves upward. By acting in these intervals, I can move the system from a state of performance that is maybe sub where a person wants to be, suboptimal, to a place of optimality. I got interested in this problem. Let me just say, how did, because Fanny always wants to know, where did you decide to do this? I fell down a weird rabbit hole. You might call it a midlife crisis. I've had so many midlife crises that I don't know if that counts. I don't think you're always allowed one, but of my many midlife crises, somewhere in about 5 years ago, I got really into a very silly sport. It's called strongman. And strongman, the best I could define it is the sport of taking weird, awkward, heavy things and moving them from point A to point B. So here are some example events. You can lift, this is somebody lifting like 200 kilogram concrete rock. Here is lifting something that looks like a circus dumbbell. Strongman comes from the circus. So that's where we kind of know that term. You can pull an airplane. This is the modern, very fancy, shiny invention of what used to be tree logs, but now we have these beautiful ornate things. Here's this thing is called a yoke because you're supposed to be an ox and carry 1,000 pounds on your back. And the thing that's funny about a lot of these strength sports, these weird patterns of like feats of strength have all sorts of long history. So the woman here, Chloe Brennan, she's the lightest person to ever do this. But these stones, I think together weigh about 700 pounds. And this is old Scottish feat of strength of picking up these stones and showing that you can do it. So anyway, I got into it. I wanted to understand how to get better at it. And that's how I learned about progressive overload, which has taken me to where, I don't know. So it's a very interesting directions, very interesting directions. So how does that work? How does it work? How do you go from that guy to this guy? You start to read. Everybody says progressive overload. You've probably, Eunice is wearing Metcon, so I don't know if you do this. But anyway, I saw somebody, yeah, I could see little signals, huh? Well, there we go. There we go. See, there it is. I can spot people. They're like little signatures. So if you look, check out her shoes afterwards. You'll see why. Anyway. So what is progressive overload? People say it all the time. It's a very simple idea. And this is not really my program, but this is a program that perhaps could be suggested to you, is that if you want to get stronger, what you do is the first week, you go to the gym and you try to do some exercise, let's say a bench press at 135 pounds. You do it 5 times. Or sorry, do it 5 times. Rest, do it 5 times. Rest, do it 5 times. Come back on Wednesday, add 10 pounds to the bar and do that. Come back on Friday, add 10 pounds to the bar. So every time we're going, it's going to be very hard, and we make it a little bit harder every period. So that's week 1, that's week 2, week 3. In 4 weeks, you're lifting 225 pounds, just like you're going to be able to do the combine. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. It doesn't work that way, fortunately. And I will say that it's actually disappointing it doesn't work this way. One of the most popular programs that people get into when they're first doing weightlifting is called Starting Strength, but this is exactly what they tell you to do. And then you get stuck. I've got stuck before. So this is called linear progression from strength sports. And it's the simplest example of progressive overload because you are progressively overloading. It's like a simple idea. But think about that picture that we had from Selye. You get tired from doing this exercise. Somehow you come back after resting and you're in a state of overcompensation, and it is kind of amazing. that if you do this right, you can every time do a little bit more than you did before. And so the goal is to just go a little bit harder than you did last time. Well, we're going to talk about that. Not dead yet. So there are mathematical models of progressive overload, and I think the most popular, well-known one is due to Bannister and his collaborators. It's you know, what is that? 49 years old now. And so the main idea is that you have some notion of work, whatever that is, that gets translated into some internal version of stress. And then you have the way that Bannister modeled it is you have some processes which are fitness, getting better at skill, having bigger muscles, more aerobic capacity, and then fatigue, which is, you know, approaching death, right? Sometimes it feels that way. I felt that way this morning. So we kind of get that balance between the fitness and the fatigue. And the way that he modeled it was exactly with one of these convolutional models. But we have, but the impulse response is very simple here. You have a exponential decaying fitness, and you have an exponential decaying fatigue. The fatigue has a negative sign associated with it. The fatigue decays faster than the fitness decays. And so you get a shape that looks like this. And this is the Bannister model. So that's our fitness, and that's our fatigue. So zoom in on that impulse response. Oh, zoom in on the impulse response. So you get tired, you go home, you rest, you eat a lot of protein, do whatever you need to do to recover, don't have a lot of stress. You come back to the gym, you're in this state, act here. What happens if I add them up? You take Bannister's model and you kind of get what you would expect. You get a slow and progressive performance, increasing over time. And if you zoom out from days to months, this is a example of what happens with doing progressive overload in the Bannister model. So initially, you have something called overreach, where first couple of weeks, you might actually get worse. Then there is a slow process of getting better. You hit a plateau as you kind of come closer here. What's fascinating though is if you know, in the model, if you stop training, you have this period where you actually get a little bit better. And so if you exercise here, you should even have more performance than you had the week before. Anyone who has done an athletic competition knows that that is the advice. You need to take a week off of low intensity before you go and compete. And the idea is to get your system to rest itself, have those fitness effects grow, and have some of the fatigue damp out. And then maybe if you stop training, it decays. I feel like this decay is too fast, but linear models, they can only do so much. Yeah, man. Yes, it's linear. It's linear. So again, I don't think that's, to be fair, right? These are models, but you know, there's principles that come out of the models here. And Conrad actually asked me this earlier this week. What happens if you just go really hard too much? That overreaching period can go on for a really long time. So to answer your question, right, you don't want to go to death. What do? You go to fatigue. So if you have a fatigue level where your body, because your body will just say, dude, stop. Unless you're a CrossFitter, in which case that gets turned off somehow. I don't understand. But for most normal people, your body will tell you to stop. And it's interesting that you can do this progressive overload and never get better for a very long period of time because you're going too hard, and then all of a sudden get better. And the model does predict that. And people do see that. And Conrad was telling me an example of, it was alpine climbers who go into this. Oh, he's already forgotten. That's fine. That's fine. Cool. So now we get to stuff that actually became research. Somehow this became research. So I was mentioning this to Paula, who's in the audience here. And she came up with a really nice generalization of this Bannister model, which, you know, the Bannister model has very specific parametric form. It is useful, but like, do you need it? What she proposed instead was, look, we know it's negative up to some time. We know it's positive after that. Okay, let's just make that the assumption. And then let's make the assumption that this part decays faster than this part. So that's the what I'm calling the generalized Bannister IR model. I could call it the Gradu model. Either way, this is a fairly simple approximation. It's not approximation, a kind of bigger class than just what the Bannister model captures. And now we can think about, if I have such a model, what is training? I can put it into being an optimal control question. I would like to maximize a final performance subject to not dying, having a bounded amount that I can do, and make it, the input is always positive, and dynamics. That's my optimal training model. And a theorem that Paula proved that is really cool is that for any Bannister model like this, there is some time where you do progressive overload up to that time, stop training, and that will get you your optimal YT. So effectively, in math, proved what every gym bro knows. with a very, very weak non-parametric assumptions here. Now, okay, we never published this because, again, what's the point of publishing what every gym bro knows? But Paolo was interested in other problems, and so that's good. There are other things that you could think about. Once you have this idea that the body has all sorts of adaptive processes in it, there are other things we could think about. And one that she was particularly interested in was models of addiction and hedonic behavior. So there is as we keep moving forward in time here, now we're in 1980, a model of addictive behavior that's proposed by Solomon, which he calls opponent processes. But opponent processes end up just being the gas model flipped over. Now you take some substance or you do some activity that you like, that causes you to go up. But then your overcompensation is you end up feeling worse somewhere down the line than you started off. There's your overcompensation. Again, now this is a negative kind of overcompensation. You take some substance, a drink, you wake up the next morning, who knows? And what's interesting is in the literature, people have observed something that they call allostasis, which I do not have time to talk about today, but we will maybe next time get into, where if you keep doing this addictive behavior, you have this downward drift, which is just progressive overload flipped over. So if that's the case, you could think about tapering a medication or drug cessation as a problem of just saying, how should I stop, not increase, but decrease the amount of the substance. And Paolo did this big survey of the literature, and all you see is that people propose the same thing for everybody. Everything becomes this one size fits all. It's like, I'm going to tell you to take 4 today, and then I'm going to tell you to take 3 tomorrow, and I'm going to tell you to take 2 the day after that. Why one size fits all is promoted, I don't know. And there are widely reported negative consequences for tapering too rapidly. Everybody, I mean, we all know about it. If you try to get off too quickly, it causes all sorts of remission in this behavior. So why can't we just take this idea of taking the opponent process and flipping all the inequalities around? So just take our opponent process, flip all the inequalities around, and then just try to apply the same basic idea. So we can have a generalized opponent process, just being the negative of a generalized Bannister model. Can we then frame this problem of minimizing the cumulative amount of some substance taken? Let's say we're trying to get off a substance. We want to minimize the cumulative amount, subject to, again, staying over, this case is not death, but some kind of tolerable level of well-being. And the dynamics of a generalized opponent process. Turns out, Paolo proved that if you have one of these underlying opponent processes, then the optimal thing to do, now this is assuming that you know the opponent process, so we don't know how to do this in practice, but imagine if I knew the impulse response, so I know your impulse response. But if I did, then the optimal thing is you just take the smallest amount that keeps you above your floor. It's like just the minimum amount that you can to stay okay. And you just do that every day. And that will actually minimize your total cumulative dose. And if it's possible to get your end dose to 0, this will get you there. This is the optimal controller. What's interesting is the optimal controller does not require any planning, just like progressive overload. The only thing progressive overload needed planning for is when to stop. Here, we just want to stop, so it's fine. We don't need to plan at all. It is a greedy policy. Don't need the history, don't need the model. You just need to be able to compute what the next step is. And in fact, because that's all you need for the optimal policy, it shouldn't be that surprising that something like this works. at least in assuming an opponent process, something like this will work. You have some scale for how you're feeling. You have what you felt like yesterday, and you have the worst that you could tolerate today. If we can articulate those three things, then you could, something like this will actually work. Again, assuming the atonement process is reasonable. The dose you should take today is whatever you took yesterday minus some difference between how high you were above the floor. If you felt good, you'll take less. If you felt worse, you take a little bit more. What is this thing? There we go. So it comes back again. Integral control, again, now as therapy. And moreover, you could prove that if your underlying system is an opponent process, that this thing, which is not the optimal policy, keeps you above your floor, and you get closer and closer to that as t goes to infinity. So this is just like a little bit of a taste of the kind of things we could do with treatment maintenance. Oops. Where am I going? There we go. There are all sorts of things you could imagine, simple optimal control problems where the optimal policy is probably going to be pretty simple. And you don't necessarily even need to know what the model is, really. And that, I think, leads to the future. So maybe that's where I want to close. Is like, I like to talk about this theory of doing statistics when n is 1. Or I think Ida Sim likes to call it statistics when n is me, which I think is the other way to think about it. And I think there is a lot to say here, to think about this relationship between experience, about therapy. It does become a little bit more about control. I have so many questions. I don't have to necessarily read all of these to you, but I will talk to you. There's a potluck that we're a little late for that I will happy to talk to you about all of these. And yeah, I think that does kind of like just open up this broader question. There are all sorts of things where we can think of ourselves as simultaneously being a treatment group and a control group. And I do think there are interesting theoretical questions there. Like what is the right way to think about that? What is the right way to think about this kind of intersection of statistics and control and learning at that interface with these applications that I think would be valuable to so many people. All right, I will stop there. Especially, there have been a bunch of people I've been talking to about this, notably Paula, who did all of the technical content here. But I'd also like to thank everyone else listed here for helping me kind of get through some of these ideas, which are all very preliminary. And thank you for listening and being my first audience for this. There will be more to come.
Time for 5 minutes for questions.
So your demedication protocol, that's just self-administered drug treatment. Like it's a new standard, or like a popular standard in opiate treatment for post-surgery now. Like
is it?
Yeah.
Well, you'll have to point me to that. This is good. That's helpful.
Basically, to say, I think a lot of it is like late stage chronic diseases, but it's the same problem where they put them in that situation.
I will say in this context, I've been trying to talk to, so part of what we've been doing, and we're still working our way through it, is finding collaborators to work with this on. And as you know, in medicine, very broad. And so the person we talked to in the pain clinic at UCSF said that almost across the board, what they do is they just send you home with those linear instructions. And they don't even ask how much drugs you took in the hospital. They just, every procedure has an amount of opioid associated with it. So, but it's good. I'm sure I would love to, I will bug you for those references.
So you mentioned that you rarely see PID control reforms, right? But if you look at, say, robotics and so on, I mean, PID controls are very, very common.
Yeah.
Why don't we observe that in nature?
Well, let's just first say, so I have a very crude statistic that I got from Carl Astrom, and I know that it's probably out of date. But Carl went and did a survey of all sorts of industrial, process control, certain robotics control. He found 90% were PI controllers. This is like all control systems out in the world. The survey they did, 10,000 different systems, 90% were PI. So that's all I was kind of commenting on. I think the body definitely does PID. Anytime you have something moderately predictive, I'm sure we could find one.
For example, I mean, long time ago, right? Did a lot of experiments with robots following stuff. And
trajectory tracking always uses low-level PID, but that's a robot. So could we find it in the body? That's a different story. But I can. There are a couple of examples in Mustafa's paper. Yeah. Go ahead.
So the shape curve that you showed when you were talking about progressive overload, it really reminded me of the spike after potential.
Oh.
I think this is where you mostly see this curve. So when it plays a big role in neuroplasticity also learning into it. So do you want to make any parallels between what?
That is a great connection. I wonder if the neuroscientists in the room have any thoughts on that. I don't, but actually a really interesting connection.
Just from a dynamical system.
Yeah, why should that why should that have that same over response?
Yeah, you have a sense of what we call like resistance to treatment. Is this treatment, or is it is there like a control theoretic way?
About resistance to treatment, that's a great question too. When you say that, you mean like a person is like resistant to a drug or something, resistant to a therapy. The thing that's funny is like, the things that are popping into my head are either going to be cancer or bacteria. Bacteria become resistant to treatment because they're trying to maintain homeostasis. So they're adversarial here. They have their own issues. Bacteria are remarkably resilient and able to generalize. So, but I didn't have time to talk about that. But with regards to things in cancer, it is harder to say. I think there are lots of people who think about cancer as a regulatory disorder. And I do think that's a very interesting way to think about what the therapies associated with that would be. And it's quite possible that with the overtreatment, it's just that you are pushing the body too close to that line, that toxicity line that I showed in Celia, which I can just bring back up real quick. Right, I mean, that toxicity line, like what part of the issue that you have here is not only is that is the body like the cancer is probably trying to resist that, but the rest of your body is becoming even more susceptible. So.
I just wanted to ask: is it possible to decompose these two when the body overcompensates and we get stronger? Is it possible to decompose it into a mental aspect?
Ah, what a great question. What a great question. I love that question. And I completely skirted it. Because the brain does some crazy stuff. And that's actually where your D comes from a lot of the time. Because the brain could do all sorts of prediction that I focus on calcium homeostasis, which is just like a gland just kind of sitting there and responding to a calcium level, right? But once the brain's involved, everything gets so much more complicated. And a word I said, which very briefly, was allostasis. That's one way that people think about how the brain anticipates future disturbances and then tries to get you into these other states. So it's like, for example, if you're stressed all the time, your blood pressure goes up and then it stays there. And people use that as an example of allostasis, an undesirable endpoint, because you're constantly preparing to be agitated. So the brain does all sorts of wild things. Conrad talked about some of them and the kinds of things that are learned and meta-learned. And a lot of that, as we know, that a lot of that is just not even conscious.
So with that, let's thank Ben again. That was great.
Yeah.
So with this, this is the end of Simon's this year.